We are in the world today. I wanted to read this out loud to you, especially that first line. Fishtrap invites diverse voices into inclusive, brave spaces. It's who we are. We value thoughtful, honest, empathetic communication. Fishtrap inspires creative expression through curiosity, learning, and sharing. This is who we are. This is why we do the work we do. So and as far as I'm concerned, this is what we're going to continue to do, and including keeping those words diversity and inclusion on that value statement. So I just wanted to start out today with that statement. So thank you. So here's what's going to happen. First off, I am going to invite. I'm a little nervous about this, Rich, but we're going to do it. I'm going to invite Fishtrap co-founder Rich Wanschneider. I think most of you in the room know that if there would not be a Fishtrap with this man, he is continues to be a presence at all of our events, and he's a mentor to Mike and I, and a friend. So he had a couple of words he wanted to start out with this morning, so I'm going to do that, and then after that, we're going to have what I hope will be. I always have a goal with these panel discussions when I'm here that it feels like you're sitting in a living room on the floor with a bunch of people who are having a fascinating conversation in a sofa. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a conversation. I will tell you, you will have an opportunity at the end to have a question. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about what a question is. You've heard me say this before. If you have an anecdote you'd like to share, that's what happens afterwards over coffee. But we'll talk about that. For those folks that are joining us online, you will also have an opportunity to do that. Our friend Janice is monitoring the Zoom communication, and she will type and make sure that Mike or I have your questions, and we can make sure that they're asked. So that will happen at the end. Then we'll have a little reflection, and then we're all going to go off and think about things. So, or if you're me, you're going to just fall asleep. So that's the plan for today. So with that, I would like to bring up my friend and mentor in all things Fishtrap, Rich Wanschneider.
Thanks for my 2 minutes. Where do I need to stand?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to just say a word about fish trapping Indians. In our founder, one of our founders was Alvin Josephie, who wrote the book on the Nez Perce, who wrote the Indian Heritage of America, was a friend to Indians across the country, a friend to Bobbie Connor's grandfather. And I get choked up on this stuff. In 1997, the year that Bobbie moved back from Sacramento, where she was working for the government, to take over Tamástslikt, we did a fish trap program called Circling Back. We had Horace Axel teaching a Nez Perce language and culture class. We had Elise Passion, the daughter of Maria Tallchief, and a fine poet here. We had Sandy Osawa, the filmmaker, Macaw. They met, and Sandy, if you didn't know, did the film Pepper's Powwow on Jim Pepper. And Sandy and Elise collaborated and did a film on for PBS on Maria Tallchief's life. So that happened in 1997. We had an Indian quilter who did this quilt, and I can't remember her name because she got sick and didn't come. Anyway, towards the end of his life, Alvin had said he reviewed Undaunted Courage, and he said, well, that's a nice book and another telling of the white guy's story of Lewis and Clark. I want to know what the Indians have to say. So Bobbie Connor and Debra Earling both have chapters in this book, which I highly recommend. And the book came out, and Debra came to Fishtrap. I should say first that Bobbie and I worked then together after she got here on the Homeland project in Wallowa. And she's back at the wheel there now, and as is Jacy. But the book came out. Alvin died. He saw the proofs, but he didn't see the finished book. And so Debra came to Fishtrap, and Debra said, Rich, what do you think of the book? And I had to say, I said, well, I was a little disappointed in this one essay. And Debra put her finger in my chest, and she said, Alvin didn't ask us to write what you white guys wanted to hear. He asked us to write what we wanted to say. So please welcome my friends, Bobbie.
You did great.
Can I say something
You
before we
sure
begin?
can.
There's been so many helpers this week, and they're kind of invisible, but they're members of a beloved community, and they're all here. And I would really like to hear, I'd like them to stand, and I would like to acknowledge all of the people from Shannon, Mike, all the people who have, this woman here, Janice, just all the people who are helping to make things happen, who are behind the scenes and who don't usually get properly thanked, and they're the ones that make these things happen. So all of you who have helped, would you please stand up, and would you say your name, please, and would you let us congratulate you and thank you.
Jessica loves to be pointed out. Yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. Yay, thank you. Thank you.
Y'all know me. I get thanked enough. I'm good. So, but thank you for that.
Well, there are also
very
some dishwashers,
Yeah.
food heaters, and a whole bunch of other people in the room who didn't say their names,
Yeah,
but thank you.
Absolutely. I also, like I had mentioned, Jeff Fields, our board chair, our volunteers, and then the most important person in the room, my mom. So yeah. That'll save me a phone call later today. It's all good. So before we get started today, come on in at any point during the time today, and you folks online already know this, but if you need to get up, use the restroom, get some coffee, grab one of Sugar Time's awesome scones, do it. Don't worry about it. I won't take offense. Jacy might, but we should be fine. So.
Yeah, there better be one left when we're done.
Yeah. Okay. Before we get started, I wanted to one more time, I put it up on the screen. This is the call to action from EcoTrust that I read the other night. And I just thought it would be worth it to go over this one more time. I wanted to thank them, and Lisa Watt, as Bobbie pointed out to me the other night, is really the driving force. She's in their Indigenous leadership. Former, okay. This is beautiful. And they do give permission to other organizations to use this. So it starts out with, while land acknowledgements are not intended to be respectful, they oversimplify complex tribal histories and fail to recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization that tribal communities continue to live with to this day. In a place of land acknowledgement, EcoTrust staff, and especially the Native staff, are asking you to support Indigenous communities by take action. I'm going to ask the same thing for Fishtrap and for our own community. Number one, give land back to tribes. 2, protect the environment and salmon. Tribal cultures depend on them. 3, insist that the United States respect tribal sovereignty and uphold its trust responsibility to tribes, which includes appropriate levels of federal funding to support tribal needs. Many promises to tribal nations still need to be kept. 4, elect officials and judges that understand tribal governments, relationships, and laws. A few of you pointed that out the other night, that this was new to you, and this is a really good thing to be aware of. Number 5, invest in tribal economies. Number 6, challenge and reject all stereotypes about Indigenous people. 7, insist that your children and grandchildren are taught accurate information about the histories, cultures, and contemporary lives of Indigenous peoples in your school system. And 8, inform yourselves about issues impacting Indigenous communities and speak up. The sovereignty, well-being, cultures, and languages of Indigenous peoples are born of their homelands, and that makes these lands and waters precious to Native communities. All of us have the responsibility to treat them with respect and care they deserve, and to steward them carefully for the next generations. Please do your part. There is, some of you may have gotten this when you walked in, Wallowa, our friends at Wallowa and Perce Homeland have a reading list, a recommended reading list. That's something that you can take action on right away, is pick up a copy of that list and many of those books are available to purchase. They're also available to borrow. I know Fishtrap has some. I know the Jacy Center has some of them. The libraries will have some. So that obviously Nez Perce Wallowa Homeland has them. So please avail yourselves of that. And if we'll make that list for those folks that are online, you can find that list at the Nez Perce Wallowa Homeland website, and you can just follow up from there. So with that, I think you know most of these folks, but I'm going to introduce them quickly, and then I'm going to start it off with Jacy because she's one face we haven't gotten to see through the last few days. So right to my left here is Debra Magpie Earling, the formidable and awesome and wonderful author who doesn't poke people in the chest anymore, I think. You know, when he told that story, Rich says he's going to tell the story, and he comes up to me, he just hits me in the sternum, and I'm like, excuse me. So may sick my mom on you. Okay. Bobbie Connor, who is, I think for all of us, a role model. So I'm going to say that. And then Jacy, Sohappy, and getting to know her in the last about year or so. This is, I think, the third time she's been on the stage. This is just a delight. So I'm excited for you all to get to know each of them. Their bios are in the programs. But I wanted to start out with you, Jacy, because we're just going to put you on the spot. We have this question that we've been asking all weekend, and you can answer this any way you'd like. When we say, what is the West? We came to you with this topic. So what is the West? What came to your mind? How do you answer that question? Or is that a question that's even answerable for you? What does that evoke for you?
The West is home, not necessarily the West. You know, the West is home to me. This is home to me. The whole Pacific Northwest is home to me, to my people. So Wallowa feels like home. And it's the home of my people. This land raised me. It wasn't just people that raised me. So I'm very connected to this land.
There you have it. I wanted to also give you, and is there anything before we get started, again, since folks here haven't had a chance to meet you, anything you would like to say about your background, in addition to what's in the bio and the program, just anything you'd like us to know about you? First off, no, she came in from Pendleton during the snowstorm yesterday, so we're grateful she was able to come for dinner, but anything else you would like to say I just want to give you a minute so you can get caught up here.
Yeah, other than my job with Nez Perce Wallowa Homeland and also my job at Crow Shadow Institute of the Arts, I'm just an Indian girl living off this land, trying to learn as much as I can from it. I learned a lot from my grandparents about roots, about berries, about getting tested on what kind of tree is that? What kind of tree is that going down the road with my uncle? You know, getting teepee poles. I wanted to be a little Indian boy too, you know, and shoot arrows and ride horses. And so I think that these jobs found me at the right time, and I get to express myself back to the land, and I get to pay it forward. So I'm really excited like that this is a topic because it's important to me.
Great. Thank you. Like I said, I just wanted to give you a little extra love on the stage today because you're fun to listen to. So there was a bunch of things we've talked about over the past few days, and there's some comments that was really hard for me. I had started out with a whole list of things I was going to go to, and then you two made some comments over the questions over the last few days the big questions that we asked, and it took me in a completely different direction. So I'm going to start out yesterday, and then Jacy started with this a little bit. When we talked about who owns the West, there was some really interesting, particularly Bobbie, you had some interesting points to make about as Jacy just talked about the relationship with the land. One of the things that popped into my head was the idea about the future responsibility when we talk about thinking 500 years from now or 500 years ahead. I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit.
So Tamástslikt, our Indian law, our traditional law, has many, many lessons for us, including the laws in order of the first foods that Jacy's talking about. But what most people don't realize is that there are fundamental precepts in our law and that we didn't live in chaos. We had social order and we had law before non-Indians came. I once listened to in testimony in Salem for the Statuary Hall Commission, listened to a Miss Pioneer, I think it was, Daughters of the American Revolution sort of honorary role, explained to a panel I was sitting on that we didn't have a God until Jason Lee came to town. And we didn't know about God, and we would never have had God if the missionaries hadn't come. And it was a fascinating day. A lot of people apologized. But when I think about our law, what most people don't realize is that the law doesn't, when it says take care of each other, it doesn't say take care of only Indian people. In fact, the two-leggeds, the four-leggeds, all of the plants, all of the water, all of the rocks, they're all part of that law. And that's all part of our social order. And that social order is ancient, millennia. And so when we talk about taking care of our home, we're not saying with our fisheries work, with our wildlife work, with our forestation work, we're not saying that we're doing this just for us. We're saying this has to be done. And since you live here now, you can be doing this too. It's an open invitation to learn more. As Jacy and others will tell you, our longhouse is open to people to come learn when we're conducting activities there. But there's one thing you have to remember when you come to the longhouse. We have our own social order. When you see the men sitting on one side, do so. When you see the women sitting on one side, do so. If you two are attached at the hip, I'm sorry, you're going to have to stand at the doorway outside. If you see us all singing, be mindful that we're praying. Every single song is a prayer. And there will be at least 24, 25. So we don't do things cavalierly or casually. It may seem to you that you don't understand the social order, so there is none, but there is order. It is not chaos. And I've grown up watching my tribe at Umatilla become enormously successful in a number of fields of work, including economic recovery. We have a long way to go in our social and health recovery, but we're making strides every year. And when I moved home, as Rich was alluding to, I was sitting in the White Eagle Grange with my mom having breakfast. The tribal paper had just come out the Friday before, and I was listening to the conversation next to us where people were saying, those Indians, they have so much money, they don't know what to do with it. Now they're talking about buying Hamleys. And it was sort of, the conversation went on from there. And we ate our breakfast, and my mom got really quiet. She was much more polite than me. And at the end of the meal, I went to the car and I went and got some complimentary passes to the museum. And I went up to the table of four and said, please learn more about us before you judge us. You have a brand new museum just down the road that we built for the express purpose to tell our accurate history to people who have no or little information or bad information. And I think you'd really enjoy the experience. And I walked away. That was as polite as I was going to be that day. And as over the last 26 years, listening to these conversations about, the Indians own Hamleys, they'll probably stop eating there, or whatever the backhanded sort of slur or insult is. I remind myself that what people are afraid of is that when we have clout, when we have economic power, when we are organized, they are afraid that we will treat them the way we've been treated. That turnabout is fair play. That's not in our social order. We weren't raised that way. We put up with a lot of insult and injury over the last couple hundred years, along with just plain genocidal practices. And we are still expected to come from the philosophy of abundance, not scarcity. We are still expected to be kind to each other, to be kind to the planet, to do hard work every day in that direction, and to be humble, not to be arrogant, to realize that we are infinitesimal on this planet and we have much to do, and we need every set of hands. We need every good brain. If we're going to take care of what we have as a home, we need everybody on it. It's not just our ancient law for us. It's the ancient law that has groomed and sustained. It's our beloved homeland that hears our voices. So it's an open invitation to learn more. And I'm not asking you to do as we do. You don't have to do it the same exact way. But if you have a plot of land, by God, stop poisoning it. There are some very simple opportunities. And if we think about the West as all of the interconnected rivers that take care of us, because we're not going to make it without water. And we think about how those rivers are at confluences are coming together. That's how most of the planet works. We have to follow the planet's example. And it's, I think sometimes more than anger, because it used to be more anger, but now it's impatience for me. The older I get, the more I get impatient with stupidity. I'm sorry, there's just so much opportunity to learn. Why shut your mind down early? This just seems crazy. And so being in our home, being in this country, this much loved country, we know that there are other people who love this country. They feel that bond with this place. And so do something about that. Don't just feel it. Don't just enjoy the high off of it. Do something about it, because that dam needs to have fish passage if it's going to be rebuilt. That's all.
Debra, you laughed. Is there something you would like to?
Yeah. Did I laugh?
Well, I mean, you laughed in a good way, as in I agree, I'm assuming, but I want to give you, by the way, what this conversation, as you all know, please feel free to come up, ask, and this is a conversation. So, I want to avoid the wait for your question, but is there something, that being said, is something you'd want to tack on to that? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I deeply respect these women, and I'm honored to be in your homeland, and thank you for welcoming me. And the Nez have long welcomed the Bitterroot Salish, and we had a working relationship. My great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother used to come down to learn how to ride horses, learn how to bead. We had a simpatico relationship that was long, so long. And, I've always felt deeply saddened. My grandfather, my great-grandfather was Paul Charlo, who was the last recognized chief of my tribe, of the Bitterroot Salish. And my family was forcibly removed from the Bitterroot. And one of I think my people's deepest sorrows that when Chief Joseph came through seeking refuge, that it was my grandfather who said, I believe in order to protect, well, he thought he was protecting us. He said, we can't help you after all those years of our relationships, the strength and the power that we had together as peoples. And Joseph went on, and Joseph, finally, and I think about this, like the power of his words saying, at bare pause to turn and face, the cavalry and the government coming after him and saying, from where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. One of the things that I've always been really, it's really important to my people, my culture, is that we accept the sins of our forefathers and our relations. It doesn't go like it's not like, oh, that happened years ago. We it's all over now. It isn't. As we accept that we have a responsibility to future generations, we recognize that there is a continuum in life and that we are all connected. And that these sorrows and these joys, they don't easily, they don't pass, they go on, they continue. And in our blood, maybe we can all heal the past, all the things that we feel that we have done wrong. There's opportunities for each of us in this room to change those patterns, to heal, to go forward, to learn. And when I think of who owns the West, my mother and my aunties were they were put in boarding schools as well as my brother and my sister. And so my great grandmother, she would my mom said, you didn't hug my grandma. Like she would grab both your hands and she would say, stem aspos, which means what's in your heart. And I think this community does that, like in their own way says, what's in your heart. I love that Rich gets emotional and expresses emotion. I studied with the great Lushootseed speaker. It's about coastal Salish. And she was from Chief Sealth's people. And I loved when I studied with her and she would stand in front of the classroom, talk Shablu. She would stand in front of us and she would thank us. And she would open her hands and say, I have nothing than what the Creator gives to me. And every day, she holds her hands to receive that. And she would stand in front of us after we had a test. And she would just weep and thank us. And she was not afraid of emotion. And I think, where did we get that idea to be afraid of our emotions? The power of the love that we have for each other in a community.
It's really interesting, Debra, that you say that because I sometimes get choked up as well, but mostly because we miss our grandmas. We miss those teachers, but our culture teaches us to be strong and to be disciplined. And our culture tells us that there's a time for weeping. There's a way, there's a when, there's a where. And it's something we do in the morning, not at night. Preferably, if you can, have ceremony around it so that you're taking care of your strength, your inner fortitude, and you're using it to prepare yourself for what's next. So if you're in mourning, if you have grief, to own it, embrace it, use it. Don't waste it. It's it's a gift that we're given. But it's not messy or sloppy. You know, I remember after my grandmother died, I thought one of my relatives was inebriated in public and was carrying on and I think tearful. And it was at night and it was like breaking all the laws. It was like, oh my God, you know, just pray for him. That's what we're told. Just pray for him, because you don't correct him. You don't tell him. You can't change him. He has to change himself. And so pray for him. And I think that that's probably one of the things that, of all of the things about the West, when I think, yesterday I said, I think about the Indigenous West. I don't think about the Indigenous West because I want it to be empty of white people. That's not why I think about it. I think about the Indigenous West because I think about that as a benchmark for how this planet was being cared for. When we were having cultural or controlled or healthy burns, when we were grooming our people in isolation for accepting spirit into their guidance, when we had other ceremonies in the landscape that no one else understood, we were working with the land. We were working with the animals and the plants and the spirits, the sentinels, the guardians that live on this land. We weren't working alone. And that connectivity, everybody can work for that. And so I think about, you know, the grief of people who look at where there was once a stream and there's no longer a stream, or there used to be abundant roots or berries, or where a forest has been clear cut, or where the alteration of the landscape has been injurious. And I think about those things and I think, yeah, we do get overwhelmed by grief sometimes. The same way we do when we lose a young person in our community to fentanyl. It's the same pain. It's the same pain. And we have plenty of it, but we're supposed to, just like our tears, we're supposed to use it. We're supposed to embrace it, own it, do what we need to do to take care of ourselves and keep going. And I really have to be mindful that in this place, probably in this valley, in these mountains, I feel things much more exponentially than I do from a distance, because we feel the land. We feel our ancestors with us. And people, I think, often get sort of romantic about sort of how we live in the past. We don't live in the past. We live in today. We use cell phones, we drive cars, we use microwaves. But the ancient teachings are more precious every year. They don't get less precious over time. They get more precious. And the more people that take care of those teachings, the stronger we are. And so that's why we have a longhouse, because we want to be strong. We have a longhouse because our elders, they didn't want it fancy. They just wanted it finished. They wanted it big enough to have fit all the people in and get it done. We tend to get distracted by making things prettier than they maybe need to be and less functional than they need to be. But that's because, you know, lots of people have ideas about how we should do things. And oftentimes I'm reminded that our old people were really efficient and always prepared. And that's what being in this valley reminds me of. How we came over with all the tied up bundles of dish towels, all of the pots and pans we needed, all of the digging containers or the root containers, any of the, everything was tied up. Nothing was loose, nothing was rattling in the back of the bed of the pickup. Everything was tied up and ready. And when we set up camp, everybody had, you know, a busy job. And we were camping for 2 to 3 weeks. And we were not camping in our perspective, we were moving home. We were moving our home from this place to this place and this place to this place. And so we never felt like occupiers. We were never unsettled in the West, waiting for someone to come settle the West. And that for me is always the comical thing. It's like, we'd like the West to be settled like it was before, when our ancient laws prevailed. And that's a really high benchmark.
You know, years ago when I was working for the Salish Culture Committee, I was with the two elders who really were fluent in Salish, and they told me they were going to take me over to see blind mows because I wanted to know about my grandfather Klotsky's magpie cap. I wanted to know his stories. And they go, "Oh, we'll take you over to blind mows. He'll tell you all the stories." So I went over to there was blind mows, and blind mows. My mother said, "You went to see blind mows?" She said, "He looked like blind mows. He had long white hair, and his eyes reminded me of shells, because they were closed. He'd always been blind, and he had the cleanest house I've ever seen. The floors were, I went in and thought, how did you clean your house? His floors were shining, and all his pots and pans were shining. He didn't have a couch, so we had to come in and sit on two beds, which he had made as tight as possible with the white sheets. And he sat down and he started telling stories, and he'd only speak in Salish, wouldn't speak English. So they started telling, so I was able to catch some words, and I could catch my grandfather. And then he began to say something that you could feel it in the room, this power of like language. But he would point to places specifically, and every place, gathering spot, had a word for it, a specific word. And they said, so the people could find each other. So it wasn't like, we will meet you here, but they knew exactly where they were meeting, and all the vast landscape, they knew exactly where they were going. But he started to talk, and he said, started to say these words, and I'll never forget this. Clarence Woodcock, who was a fluent speaker and on the Salish Culture Committee, and one of the elders, he was like, "Blind Mose, what are you saying?" He broke into English, and he said, "What did you just say?" And Blind Mose wouldn't. He said, "Please try to explain this concept in English to us," because he talked for a long time, and they lost the language that he was speaking. They lost the words, and they said, "Please tell us what you're saying." And he wouldn't speak in English. Try to say it in Salish. And I'll never forget when we stepped out of his little cabin, which he lived near where all the burial site. So I thought he was in commune with all the spirits. And he used to, there's just something about blind Moses. And they came out, and the two of these translators were weeping, and they said, we cannot get this back. And it was part of that language. I thought how powerful and beautiful our language still is, but so many parts, because we were in the heat of that, right there. He lived right in the shadow of the mission church, right there where the boarding schools had been. And it was huge. If you look at the old boarding schools, they were big. They all burned down, which is like but they were huge buildings. So when I think of my homeland or my people or who I'm related to, they always have these pretendings, like people say, and I think, you know who somebody is because you know their family. Like you can, I love going to what used to be the Indian bars, and they're like, "Who are you? Who, kind of who can vouch for you?" So all these, all these, and you figure out like, "Oh, I'm related to you." So there's all these things, but what it truly is with Native people is a storied past and a storied present. So all the stories, it's not just all the old traditional stories, it's everyday people will connect you and tell you stories and tell you who they are through their stories. And, and I think about that, when the Catholics came in, and it happened in other churches, and shamed. My mother always used to say, I have an inferiority complex. Don't pay attention to me. I have an inferiority complex, because every day she was in the residential school. She never got to go home. She never enjoyed. There was one nun that was kind to her, but all of them would say, you're stupid. And when my mother was in the 8th grade, there was a lay person who was in the school, and she told my mother, you're too stupid to learn, but I will give you A's if you go home and clean my house. So my mother cleaned her house, and my mother had calluses on her knees from scrubbing floors. She became a housekeeper, and that was something that she lived with. And I thought, and my great-grandmother used to say to her when they'd come home, because they were punished for speaking the language, and my great-grandmother told her, don't, because they'd come home and they'd say, oh, I jokes. And my grandma said, don't you say that. Don't you give these white people, don't let them know that you're Indian. Like you speak in the same English that they speak. Don't have an accent, just don't. And she would, insist on that so that her grandchildren would not be punished. But here's something that does disturb me in Native communities. It really bothers me. And it's like, it's not who owns the West, and if we think of stories as the West, and who owns the stories. Who owns these stories? And it's, Native people are aware of this. Like, who are you to tell this story? There's protocols to telling stories. Some people, especially along the coastal Salish, they have storytellers that they are trained to be storytellers, and they can tell a story in perfect breath from the beginning of the story that takes place over 4 days over ceremony, and they will tell that story without end for that. And there are storytellers who save us, but everyone in the community is a storyteller and keeps the story going. What concerns me is, number one, technology. If you're always scrolling through your phone or you're looking for somebody else's stories, you have no story. You're not doing, you're not out living a life with other people. Get off your phone. Get off your scrolling. Another thing that happens is, one of the things that really disturbed me was David Grann when he wrote Killers of the Flower Moon. And I met David Grann when I was at South Dakota. And I said, I have a bone to pick with you, David Grann. And he goes, I'm sure you do. He kind of skirted around me really fast. I wanted to, if I don't like to touch people or in any way act toward violence, so I wanted to apologize if I did that, Rich. I tell you, he came into that community, and I was talking, then I feel like I was talking to Louise Erdrich, and I said, do you know he got, I said, it's wiped from social media now. You can't find it on the internet. But I said, I swear he got $7 million advance for his book, Killers of the Flower Moon. $7 million. And so she goes, oh, well, she goes, well, I was wondering, because who would be in Osage? She goes, for 5 years, because he was with the people. She goes, have you been to Osage? I said, no. She goes, well, you wouldn't want to stay there for 5 years, let me tell you. But he went in and he not only took that story, told that story, he extracted that story. So that story, then became a major motion picture. And he got paid another $5 million for that from Scorsese. And I think about that story and I think, now those people in their communities were putting up the families. They've lost these people, and they've lost their chance to really tell the story that matters, because the story has been extracted and taken from them. No one will buy their story from them now. No one will really listen, because there's a definitive story told by a non-Native person, by a white man. And so I know they celebrated that. They were happy to go to Cannes. They had many people were happy about that. But I thought, the price you pay for your story And I don't know any Native person who like tells a story in such a way that it disappears. You know, it becomes part of the whole everything. And I was reading online, and I thought there was line after line after line. They go, I love this. I love this stuff, love this story. And I thought, what do you love about this story? You know, of people being murdered, Native people being murdered in Osage. Like, what do you love about this story? So I'm always concerned about, you know, one of our most powerful resources are our stories. And they're, you know, not only stories of trauma, but great stories of beauty, and stories of joy will make me cry. Like I can't, like when Sacagawea came home to her people and she was overwhelmed to see them with joy, could not stop crying. There are stories that are so powerful in our communities. They're about our trauma. Also, they're about the strength that we have, how we've been able to survive. And those are our stories. You know, I love the Kootenai medicine woman warrior story, and I love this. I heard from I was the first public defender in the tribal court system when I was 18. And I heard the story from Chief Judge Burke, and she was Kootenai, and she'd tell me about Kokum and all that. Like I heard all these stories about her. And that story was also taken, like in some ways, by an anthropologist, and then somebody else has written about it. But it's still, and I thought that's a powerful story of a Kootenai medicine woman warrior. And she said to me, you tell that story one day. And I said, I thought about how important those stories are. And I think, you know, when I taught a Native American literature class, I started having my students tell stories. I had one non-Native student, a white guy, came up to me and he said, I'm disappointed in this class because I just got out of Cornell, so I was talking Derridian theory. Like, so boring. It's really like no things you don't even understand. It's kind of like pushing ideas around up there. You know, it doesn't have any meaning to most people. And this guy came up to me and he goes, I was really hoping because you're Native that you would tell stories. And I remember looking back out at you know, I was looking at my classroom, and it was a hot day, and their eyes are like drooping, and they're like ready to sleep. And I pushed back and I began to tell a story. You know, and Leslie Marmon Silko says, as I began to tell the story will begin to happen, set into motion now. And you can feel that, you know, power of story. And so what I'm saying, you know, I used to try to get my students who were, a lot of them non-Native, who say, you know, who are white students, I'd say, what is your story? I was with so many people, have you had this? And they go, you're lucky you're Indian because you have stories. I was like, what? You're removed somehow? Like, but everybody has a story.
ancestors.
Yeah, ancestors, and those stories pass through you, and you don't have to mine our stories for your opponent's stories. So what I'm saying, in this community, the weave of those powerful stories, like we all have, you know, hearing that last night, hearing this different stories that were read, and the, you know, the beauty and power of people's stories, you know. So I guess I'm saying we all have our own stories, and I think a lot of Native people that I know, they want to tell their stories. We have historians, anthropologists, we have scientists, we have Pulitzer Prize winning, Booker nominated. We can tell our stories.
I thank you. That's the best explanation to me about the need for folks to tell their own stories. That's the best I've heard that explained. I'm gonna turn to Jacy, and you've taught. I know. I'm sure there's lots going through your head right now, but I'm curious. You know, we've talked before, even on this stage. You still have children that you're raising, and I know your daughter is 18, 19, if I remember.
She's just turned 20.
Goodness. How are you telling stories or including that tradition that you're passing that on to her? How does storytelling play a part in this for you?
I don't intentionally make it happen. It just happens. I feel like storytellers are like built into our family, into our history, and you hear it so many times that you continue telling the story without like, oh, hey, let me tell you a story. It just kind of happens. It just kind of happens. And I don't know how many times I've told her certain stories until I hear her talking with other people, like at her. She's Happy Canyon Princess for 2004 or 2024. And during her interview, I was sitting, a couple of rows behind her while she was doing her interview. And they were like, if you don't happen to get picked, would you try out again? And she said, well, if this time comes around again next year and the creator wants me to do it, then he'll put it in my path and I'll try out again. And I go, winning, all the things that I'm saying to her are sinking in and she's listening, because sometimes, with teenagers, it doesn't feel like they're listening. And especially she's me, and I'm not that great of a listener. I'm a great talker. I'm a better listener now than I was when I was 20.
Aren't we all? I hope so.
But I like that she pays attention, and that she is paying attention to other people's stories, and that she is listening to my grandma's stories and my grandpa's stories. And she brings those stories up that maybe I don't tell as much or I didn't remember. And she gets to also pass these stories on. So she also gets to be part of that. But I don't have to teach her that. I have to do it. I have to be the one that's doing it so that she's following me. I can't tell her, go on that path because that's the right path. I have to do it. I had to change my life. I had to say, what do I want in my life and what am I asking for? And what am I praying for? I'm not praying for a nice house. I'm not praying for land. I'm praying for happiness and health for my family. I'm hoping that my grandkids are happy and they get to drive into Wallowa and say, oh, this feels like home too. That the West isn't owned, that we are owned by it. I belong to this land, and I belong to my grandparents and all these women and men that came before me. I belong to them. And that any of this stuff that we're trying to build, I'm borrowing that from my grandkids that aren't born yet. This isn't ours. I don't get to take this to the grave with me. What I got is my knowledge and my stories. That's what makes me rich. Everything that I can take to the grave with me, that makes me rich. I want the most light that I can carry. That's why you have to cry. You have to let it go. Because if you're holding on to this darkness, how is that light going to fit in? How is it going to fit if you want to keep all that shadow? You have to cry it out, and then it makes you feel better. Because what an amazing feeling that you get to grieve somebody. Because they meant so much to you that it still hurts today. That it's been 10 years since they've been gone, and you miss them like it was yesterday. What a gift. And it's not that I'm sad that they're not here, because they get to be in the light of the Creator. They get to be held in its warmth. Everything that we want, everything that we get to be envious of them. I get to be envious that my grandma left before me. I get to be envious that my brother left before me and he gets to go hug my grandma. I get to be wishful that when I get to be old and the Creator, when Mother Earth takes me back, and I get to go and hug those people. Now, I'm so sad without them. I am sad without them. I am. But my grandma gave me all the tools. She gave me the tools because she wanted me to be the best me. She wanted to lift me up. And so that's what I get to do, because she taught me to do that. And so we can't forget that this isn't ours. None of this is ours. We have to work really hard So the land, you get everything that you put out is going to come back to you or your family.
Mhm.
So if you have ugliness, it might not necessarily come back directly to you. It could hurt your sister next to you. It could hurt your kid next to you. It could hurt your grandma next to you. And what bad would you feel if you're sitting on this earth, living ugly, throwing garbage out your road, out the side of the road or whatever, and your grandparents are watching you and they're like, I told you, you know, we go on walks anywhere and I start picking up trash. It's not my land. It is though. All of it is. So home isn't Pendleton. Home isn't the house that I live in. Home isn't the house that I have childhood memories in. Home is this land. Home is from Warm Springs all the way to Lapway. That's home.
Yeah.
Home is any river that I can find because I need something to hold on to me and take the grief. I'm sad and I'm lonely and I'm gonna go cry and I'm gonna go sit in the river and let it take it from me. And it will take it back. And I can get something else and I can go and ask the river, I need this, and I can collect it. So when you say the West, it sounds so foreign or not mine, or that's somebody else's words. Like in Indian, there's words that can't be expressed in English. It's like that word doesn't mean anything to me. But this land is home. The mountains are church. When we talk about, I want to go to church, I need to go tell the trees something. I need to go. I'm not weird. If we talk about stereotypical Indians, sometimes I am that girl. You know, I pull over and I talk to birds. I see eagles and I'm like, oh my God. And I'm not like, oh my God, I gotta go take a picture. I'm like, oh my God, I gotta go tell him to tell my brothers this, you know, because I have two brothers that passed away and we didn't get to get old together. And I have so much stuff to tell them. So I tell the eagle, I go tell my brothers this. I go, you know, it's different. You know, the land is my family. It knows so much more than me. It's been here for thousands, millions of years. Ask it. It will tell you if you listen. So,
I think that I don't own the West. The West owns me is the thing I'm going to have tattooed on my arm when I leave here. Thank you for that. You mentioned, I'm trying to remember the power of landscape, you know, the power of the land. Debra, I'm guessing from the looks on the faces of the people, everybody that I know that moved here, I'm doing the same thing. So don't make me cry. That everybody, those of us that moved here had a similar experience of feeling like the land reached out and grabbed you and said, no, you need to be here. I think if I'm asking for myself and it's totally selfish, does that feel right to you? That's okay that they pulled some Irish white girl out of Portland and said, you need to be here now? How does that, you know, it rings true to me with this idea about, I don't own the West owns me, and that I have a responsibility. That's what it feels like to me. How would you respond to that? Do I have a right to be here? You know, what responsibility do we have to this place?
I think it's the same. Like you are getting what you give. If you put your arms out and you're doing everything that you can, like this ground is your family. And so if you put your arms out, why wouldn't it put its arms out towards you?
Yeah.
And it's just like Bobbie said, we're not here to just take care of Indians. The land is here to take care of you. If you want this to be, if this is your home, if this feels like home to you, then you pay into it just like it pays into you. Yeah. I think, you know, some people, I don't have the experience of, like, oh, I went to a faraway country and it felt like home. Yeah. You know, I have Wallowa, it's home. Yeah. I can feel it. I can feel it in my heart. like right when you come, over the pass and then you watch the mountains open up. That's my favorite thing. I like will roll down the windows so that I can hear the birds. And I'm like, I'm here. I made it back. I'm safe, because I know there's a spiritual connection. And whether your ancestors came here for or not, you still pay into it. You pay into it what it pays you. You love this place so much, so love it back the same.
Yeah.
Not like, oh, I love this house so much.
Yeah.
Oh, I love this car so much on this road so much. But I love this land so much that I want to nurture it the way that it nurtures me.
Right.
So I can't say that, no, it's not for you. It's for all of us.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what color you are. It matters that you're paying back to it because it's borrowed. This is not ours. Do you want it to be good for your great great grandkids, or do you want them to have a plot of land that nothing can grow on?
Absolutely.
And what is first foods? What are the plants that are nurturing our ground? Because it's not wheat.
I also think, like, from my perspective on the Flathead, I don't, when I go home, that isn't really my traditional homeland. But when I returned to the reservation, I worked for the tribal court, and really saw in stark contrast the difference between the white people there and the Native people there. And it's a different kind of thing when the Allotment Act, which was never supposed to open up the Flathead Reservation, came on a rider because it was our tribal dividend. We couldn't get that unless it had this other component to it, which was opening up the land to non-Indian settlement. So all the white people came in, and they gave us allotments. They didn't. I'm sorry, I'll take that back. We were never given anything.
Yeah.
They apportioned allotments and put people on these allotments. I put my grandmother out in Perma, try to farm, out there in this white alkali soil. And, you're supposed to be farmers and ranchers. And imagine that if somebody said to you, gonna put you out here and give you no tools, no, you're gonna do that. Well, people were really hungry. They wanted to feed their families. They were starving. So they literally sold their land for $35 or, and the best parcels. If you go on the Flathead, you'll see they took up all the, on the lake, there's mostly, they're owned by white people, these big parcels of land, and you look, and then they're trying to push back against this. And one of the, I have to say, one of the best feelings that I have had on the Flathead, and I get angry there. So I'm not happy on the reservation. I've just seen too much and I hit, they'll just say it. And because I can pass, people don't know me, and I can pass. They don't see me. They see me as a Sohappy. They don't. So I've heard the white people talk about Native people. And I'm angry, and I'm angry that, I am angry. I know my elders tell me, just calm down, have a sense of humor. But I don't have much of a sense of humor. And the older that I get, one of the things that really hit me was, in that mission school that my mother went to, and being told every day she was stupid, every single day, that not only was she stupid, our culture was worthless, didn't matter. And so the bison range, the National Bison Range, my tribe took over the National Bison Range. And a year ago, my husband and I went just after when the bison range was returned, we decided to take that loop around the bison range. And I have never felt so at peace on the Flathead. Never felt this. It just felt like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. You could just feel that peace there. We stopped at one place. I said, stop here. We looked down and I could see the mission church. And I thought, like, you have no power here. It just felt like for the first time, I really felt that, but I've talked too much this time, but I want to say one more thing. You know, there's a lot of young people who don't feel that really brutal sting of what residential schools did to Native people, like, and how that affected people like my mother and my aunts and the people that I know that I worked with on the reservation. And there was a split at sometimes, and I thought, and my mom told me, you be careful, you know, when I went back to the reservation and I was working, she said, you be careful because, you know, she goes, not all Indians are nice. You know, and then I was like, I didn't, you know, it's like, but I recognized in my mother was as kind and generous and beautiful as, like, I've never met anybody like my mother, as loving as she was. And she could turn and be the cruelest person. And my aunt was the same way. And then I noticed that some of my aunties and cousins that I met at that age that had been in that school were fighting that same battle. And I thought, what is this? I had an aunt who died about 4 years ago. She had been changed by the boarding school. She was 92 years old. She was an elder. And my sister called me and said, don't go see her. Don't go see Aunt Vi. She's, you know, she's mean and she's got power. Like, don't go see her. And so when she died, my brother called me and we went, and my husband, we went to the funeral. And one of the elders, who was a dear friend of hers, made all the arrangements. And we came, and there was my aunt's. You know, they brought her body in, and they had it covered in a Pendleton blanket. And there was just a priest there. And then her caregivers came in, and they were on one side. And the priest came up to me, and boy, I had run-ins with my Aunt Vi. I mean, she tried to kill my mother when I was 17, tried to kill me when I was 14, had this anger, but she could be as nice. If you were to meet my Aunt Vi, you would be friends with her. She'd come into community. She'd come, if she was able to come into Fishtrap, you'd all be nicey nice. And then she would turn you all against it because she could do it. She'd find out all your secrets. And she would say, oh, so-and-so over there is talking about you. Oh, that person. Oh, pretty nice, but not so. I mean, she could do that. So you kept a distance from her. I did. I kept a distance from her. My mother, of course, forgave her for almost killing her. My dad forgave her too. I forgave her, but I didn't want to be near her. And so when we went up, my brother goes, the priest came up, the most handsome priest I've ever seen. It was like, he was like, just so beautiful. Oh my God. He comes up and he says, you're the family? And I said, yes. And would you like to say something about your Aunt Vi? And then my brother's like, there you go, Debbie. you go ahead and you say you're the speaker, you're the writer. I go, shh. So I get up there and I'm standing there. I said, what do I say about my Aunt Vi? And I said all the good things that I remembered about her. And then this light came through the window and hit the coffin in front of me. If you've ever been in that mission church, it's a haunted church, a painted church, and it has the fires of hell painted on one of the frescoes. And I saw that light and I thought, where's that light coming from? And it came from where the school was, like where that church, the residential school was. And it just hit me that she was a product of that boarding school experience. Like, she had a beautiful soul and her soul was released. And I used to be afraid of her. My mom said, oh, when Vi dies, we're in trouble. She put a curse on her family once. people start dying in our family, like really bad deaths, really terrific deaths. My mom goes, "What's going on?" And then we looked around, and Vi had given us this totem. And my mom goes, "We're getting rid of that." And when we did, it was gone. And I'm not, my mom said, "Oh, when she was young, she used to know things." But I think about that great power that she had, that beauty that she had to make friends with everyone. And so smart and such a beautiful woman. And I think about what's with such sorrow that the residential boarding schools were so cruel to her. We're so like systematic cruelty. There's some people that I'm starting to look at when I work for the tribe, and there's, I heard all these people, "Oh, my sister went to boarding school, but she got TB and she's went away." And I thought, did she have TB? Never heard from her again. Where did she go? Where did all these Native people go who said they had TB and they're sent away? Where are those people? And these are the questions that I have, and these are the questions that, that sit on me. So I'm not, I do not know the traditions in the way that these beautiful and important and incredible women know. My line was broken from those traditions so that we could survive. My great grandma knew everything. She could survive anything. She could just, she brain tanned and, put up her own teepee. She didn't need, she went out and picked berries and roots, and she knew, about the black moss and making it into licorice. She had, all that. And she loved to gamble, loved that stick games. But I think about what those people suffered through. I can't even. And I think about that, like when you impose your religion, when you impose your ideas, and I think that's why Native people never do that. When they don't impose we don't impose our religion on you. We don't impose but to have that in such a way that everything else, like you're inferior. And I think we're facing some times when that will come for us all. And we have to be really strong in that resolve. And I think about, I just wanted to speak to that because, when people tell me, "Oh, tell the good stories," you have to tell the good stories with the bad. And I said, I think I'm Downer Debbie. I tell I'm the person who will tell those stories because I think I need to tell these stories because I have visited with some of our young people at and some of those traditions, some of those ideas have been broken. And so they feel like they're struggling with their identity because of these policies and practices. So I want to tell those stories.
What was the name of your grandmother's neighbor who was chained to the tree? What was
Mrs. Wallace?
Mrs.
Yeah.
Wallace.
Her husband was Vladimir Wallace from the old country, Yugoslavia.
I think when I listen to that story and I think about the stories, so my great aunt Vera, my grandmother's sister, was born in 1881, and I was with her, raised with her and my grandmother, as well as my grandfather and mother and many uncles and aunts. But I think about whether it's a boarding school story or a story like that one about inhumanity. That's the commonality thing that we share. And I remember a visiting professor at Whitman College talking about the French resistance during the Holocaust and saying, the stories during the Holocaust were people who gave refuge to others, people who took in refugees from boarding schools, families that hid children. And I think about what we share, and that is the people who took in and hid people during the Holocaust were people who saw a grandmother or a grandchild or a pregnant woman or a widower whose whole family had been lost, and they took them in out of humanity. We have seen and witnessed and been subjected to much inhumanity. The challenge for us about being strong, the teaching about being strong, is not to become that inhumanity, and not to be broken by acts of inhumanity and injustice and insult. And it does not mean that we have not been victimized, but I think we have all been raised. I think, I admired so much Jacy's grandmother. Her grandmother and my mother were the first Chief Joseph Day's Indian princesses back in 1948. And I have pictures of them with their fancy hairdos and Letterman sweater up at Lake. But when I think about how much I admired them, they both became public servants. Her grandmother was a nurse, my mother was a teacher. Their lifelong careers were taking care of other people or other people's children. They gave much to the world. And then I think about their parents, because Jacy's grandmother's parents used to come and visit my grandparents. And I remember serving watermelon when the old men in the living room were watching Hawaii Calls, and they would yell to the women in the kitchen who were visiting an Indian, "We're just watching the hands." And well, there was always comedy. There was always something, comic relief. But I think about the fact that also what we've inherited is agency. We have inherited not only their sense of humor, not only their fortitude, but we've inherited agency. So when my grandfather went to boarding school, his father was an ordained Presbyterian minister, and he went to seminary in San Anselmo in California. He was a man of letters. I mean, he was well-spoken, well-written. He was also mean, very strict, fire and brimstone preacher. But the experience my grandfather had was that when he went to boarding school from a public school, he was always the head of the class. When he went from public school to boarding school, he had a superior education. When he went the other direction, it was an inferior education. So he made a decision that none of his children would ever be allowed to go to boarding school. Now, we didn't have to hear about the acts of injustice from him. He just made a flat out decision that every one of his children was going to go to a public school because they were going to get a better education. And even young Joseph talked about education. Many of our headmen talked about education as one of the ways we were going to help save our people. But he also made a decision that every one of his kids was going to go to at least 1 year of college. Because when he came home from World War I, this is how being wards of the government is a little bit, is a lot painful. So he wanted to go back to Chemawa as a postgraduate, post-secondary, to learn draftsmanship and surveying. And the Indian agent said he had an arranged marriage by his father, arranged after his mother died. And the Indian agent said to the superintendent at the school, "Don't admit him. He does not need to go to school. He needs to stay here, learn to farm, take care of his wife and children." And so the decision he made was that he was denied that privilege of going to post-secondary school. So he wanted every one of his children to have at least 1 year of college. And there were only 3 acceptable institutions: Whitman, Whitworth, or Willamette. And so college is also part of our family history. One uncle was a tradesman, journeyman, whether it was heavy equipment or welding or building bridges, ironwork. But the expectation, the agency that my grandmother and grandfather had was to decide that their children not only would not go to schools where they would be punished like they had been, and they didn't talk about the ugly stuff. They talked about what you need to do to contribute, to pay it forward, to be productive, to be a contributing member of the household, a contributing member of the family, a contributing member of the society. And the expectation was always there. And when those 4 brothers went off to combat from World War II, New Guinea, 6 years, came home, alcoholic, malaria, chain smoker. The radio man for World War II, the corporal in the radio, came home and finished his degree at Willamette, played football, was inducted into the Alumni Hall of Fame with his team because they were in Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. The Marine brother who was in Korea and said, you know, MacArthur showed up when we were up to our armpits in mud, and who cares? In the artillery, and the youngest who was off the coast of Vietnam when their ship got shelled. They all did what they were supposed to do. They all made choices that their parents had set in front of them and said, you know, you can make bad choices. We'll give you the same opportunity to make a bad choice as there is to make a good choice. But one of the things I think about when people take our stories from us is they forget our agency. We have decision-making and have always had decision-making power. So the treaty was not something we wanted. It was the best of all the bad choices on the table. And we all fought. The Umatilla Reservation was never supposed to exist. There were only 2 reservations on the table, the Nez Perce Reservation in what's now Idaho that included this entire valley. All of this country was part of the original Nez Perce Reservation. Grant tried to give us back, and a clerk in Oregon messed that up, and that didn't work out. And the Yakima Reservation. Old Joseph was at that treaty council. Tuitakas, these ancestors of mine were at that council. And the Cayuse and Wallowa spokespersons held out until the end and refused to agree. Said our horses can't eat the wood in the mountains. We have a lot of horses. We can't raise our stock on trees. The Yakimas, the 14 bands that were going to be assembled there, already knew that they were going to be crowded on that landscape. And we held out until Joel Palmer, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Oregon Territory, offered up at the 11th hour of the Treaty Council, 2.5 weeks in, offered up the 3rd reservation, what's now the Umatilla Reservation. And it's a postage stamp compared to our homeland. It's a postage stamp, but we're in our own country. We don't live in exile. We live in our homeland. We know. When I moved home, when people were worried about grocery stores and banking and Y2K threats, I knew where to get meat. I knew where to get fish. I know how to feed myself there. I know where to get wood. I am not afraid to live there. Sacramento, I don't want to live on the street in Sacramento. Cement, you know? So we have agency, and we decided, and we held out for the best offer possible, the Umatilla Reservation. And more than half of the people enrolled in the Umatilla Reservation have Nez Perce ancestry, because they were more numerous when we were decimated by, the Cayuse were decimated by disease and bloodshed. That's no surprise that we have, so many of us have Nez Perce ancestry, just by sheer volume of population. And yet, I think many people see our stories as victim stories. We have always fought. We have always resisted. We have always been in protest. But how did you see the protest? The same way your family did. Her family, the same way. Best starched pants, best starched shirts, always look your best, always present your best, always be on your good behavior. If we're going to survive this nightmare, we're going to do everything we do well. Be exceptional. Because the expectation was you're carrying it forward, as Jacy's talked about. And so that agency, you know, my grandmother, I have to tell this story because my favorite story, my many grandma stories, but my favorite story about boarding school was she had been shipped, you know, care packages. They got boarding school care packages. So it had dried meat, probably dried fish, and probably even, you know, dried pears or apricots in it. Who knows? Maybe it had pemmican in it, but it was a package that she was so excited to get at Chinawa, that at Cushman, that boarding school here in Tacoma, where she was, that it was clearly gave her joy. And so it was restricted. They took it away from her and put it in a trunk in the trunk room. And so that's where it was held. And it was probably going to decay in there. It probably was never going to be consumed. And she was deprived of that. And for fresh fruit, they used to take their shoes that talked, the shoes that were worn out. The bottoms flapped, the soles.
Shoes that talked.
They would climb over the fence into orchards and they'd steal fruit and they'd climb trees and do things that weren't allowed to do in boarding school. It weren't ladylike, which is pretty much all of our ancestors, I think. And even though they never wore, these women, I was raised by my great aunt and my grandmother, never wore pants. They never cut their hair, but they were still tomboys. They rode horseback everywhere growing up. They have their favorite places on Catholic Creek and out by Ukiah, the places they love to camp in their seasonal round. But she was in the boarding school and she'd been denied her care package and by the matron who was at the head of the classroom. And my grandmother had fierce, snapping eyes. Her Indian name was Hilmat, which is like Little Thunder. Give you an idea. So, we didn't want to cross her. And so she was staring at this matron, just hateful. She said, I had so much hate in my heart. I just sat there looking at her saying, I hate you. In my head, that's all I was over and over and over. And she was, probably 12 or 13. I hate you. And that's all she could think. She couldn't hear anything. She just was thinking that singular focus. And the woman was standing at the front of the room and she fell over. And her head rolled up the aisle towards my grandmother, and my grandmother thought she had killed her and was breathless and was overwhelmed. And when she finally got her breath, eventually they realized that the woman's corset was too tight. She stood too close to the stove and her wig was what fell off when it rolled up the aisle. And my grandmother said, oh, when I realized they didn't kill her, I thought, oh man, I shouldn't hate people. She had a sense of her own power, but she had unleashed it. And I think, I was telling my friends Mary and Nancy last night, my favorite stories, teenage girls everywhere are the same. To go to town, they used to hide either the flour or they'd pretend to be out of kerosene or the coffee or whatever was going to be in short supply that would cause a buckboard trip to town from the South Reservation. And this is at the turn of the last century, 1912, 13, 14. And they would take the buckboard to town. Katie Sturgis, who was Katie Simpson at the Colville Reservation, was their cousin. Auntie Vera, the eldest sister, her little sister, who was 9 years younger or 8 years younger, and then Katie, all they needed was a nickel to go. If they got to go to town with the buckboard to get supplies, all they needed was a nickel to go to the vaudeville show. That's all it cost to get into the vaudeville show. And so this one story, I always remember. So if anybody in our house ever said, oh, now I see, she would immediately say, as the blind man said, as he picked up his hammer and saw. Oh, I see. It's like, okay, that just is in there forever. It's like an earworm. But she would also tell this story about the vaudevillian comics doing shtick. And, I have the best hunting dog. I just bought the best hunting dog. And the other guy, what are you doing with a hunting dog? You don't need a hunting dog. Where would you keep a hunting? So they go back and forth about this hunting dog and say, he's the best hunting dog. He's very, very good at hunting. And the other man says, what does he hunt? Everything, whatever he can. Well, where does he hunt? He hunts here, he hunts here, he hunts here. I remember the women in the kitchen sitting around the table eating watermelon, these old vaudeville jokes coming out. I I used to think, these are all women who spoke their languages fluently,
Mhm.
who were in charge of the sweat when we little kids were introduced to the sweat house, who she became baptized in order to marry my grandfather. She organized the lives of and raised 7 children plus a lot of other people. And I had enormous respect and fear of this woman because she just knew everything and she was so incredible. And every story she told about her childhood living on horseback on the seasonal round was better than any Disney movie ever made.
Mhm.
And I think about the stories that were funny that they told. Oh my God. And so the stories just would spill out at the table between these women because the men were in one room and the women were in one room. And that part of it was because they were transmitting women's information. These were women's stories. Men didn't talk about childbirth. They didn't talk about preparing someone for death and giving that care. Those were women's things. And so they would talk in the kitchen, and because I was, either cleaning up or doing whatever nearby, with big ears, I would hear these things. And the story that I loved the most about horseback, besides the fact that this man lost his breeches, lost his breechcloth, they were riding through brush, and somehow his belt either broke or came untied, and he didn't even notice that his breechcloth got hung up in the brush, and he rode out.
Bloomers on the line.
No breechcloth. And the same at the roundup, when they used to have the war bonnet race. People called it the Chiefs race, but it was a war bonnet race, and all the men are riding as fast as they can. Hell, for hell, just fierce riding, trying to keep a war bonnet on, tied on, and the crowd was just cheering wildly. And this guy thought he'd won the race. His breechcloth had come off.
He won one race.
Men weren't telling these stories about men. The women were telling these stories about men. And I think about those stories, and I think about the agency and the sense of humor and the resilience of our people, because we have endured so much. And the reason we survive, the reason we persist, the reason we exist today, despite the horrible amount of bloodshed we've survived, all the blood spilled from here to Canada, to Sitting Bull's country, to Oklahoma, where all of our graves are for our babies that didn't survive that country, all the way back from there, and Leavenworth, all the places we have dead buried across the landscape where they should be buried. All of that injustice. And I think about that and I remind myself, every time I get in a room where people want to talk about Nez Perce stories, most of the people who've written books about us want to talk about the war. Yeah.
And that's not what we talk about.
That's not who we are.
If you come to an Indian funeral, there's a lot more laughing than probably should be appropriate, because that's how we're getting past it. This is how we learn to get past our grief, by joking about it. But I mean, we don't. If you're not in an Indian circle and you're joking, the non-Indians won't think it's funny, but the Indians will, because we lived through it. We survived it. I'm the proof that, we survived.
Yeah.
And
evidence.
and Indians find a way to laugh about or joke about it or put it into a coyote story so that we still learn from it. It's
Always.
Still being learned from, even though that was a joke, or that's funny about that guy losing his breechcloth, Bet nobody in his family is ever going to do that again. It's a part of the story. Whether they're sad stories, they're happy stories. I remember a majority of the funny stories, probably dirty jokes that my uncle should not have been telling me at that age, but I still heard them. And about these people fighting so hard, like my Katza fought really hard to make regalia. She fought really hard to make sure that wasn't lost. She made sure that, hey, we lost enough. We're not going to lose this. So I'm going to pour it into you so that you can pour it into somebody else.
No more.
So I'm pouring into lots of people's cups what I learned, because I don't want it to be lost. So I think some of this after residential school, people are like, we're not losing anymore. We're not going to lose this. And so that's why I try so hard to make sure that I'm teaching people what I was taught because they're, again, it's not my teachings. They're not even my Kotze's teachings. They were all these collection of women's teachings, and maybe some of my uncles that are great sewers and weavers too. All of these teachings drip down into my cup, and they're all borrowed that I get to pass on to somebody else. So how cool is it that, you know, these women, these men that lives through such horrific things found a way to make a funny story about it, found a way to weave that into a basket, found that a way to, you know, to remember to tell these stories, and that my hands can still bead.
Right.
Because I was taught that, and all of this trickled down into me, and how we can keep building this up. And we don't have to be like, oh, what else are we going to lose? What else are we going to lose? What's next? That we get to build up on this.
I'm gonna break in because I need to. Unfortunately, I think we all could sit here. I did want to give you all a chance to ask questions if you had them. It's about 11:15, believe it or not. I could sit at the floor and listen to you talk forever. I will say this though, if you have a question, remember that it starts with, y'all can repeat this after me, right? Who, what, why, where, when, and how. If it starts with, well, my father back in don't just resist. Think back to the very beginning when we were talking about creating a brave space. I think my friend Jennifer mentioned the other day, you know, remind me of, wait, why am I still talking? You know, so ask those questions. I'm going to do that right now. Folks online, if you have a question, type it into the chat. And I can't promise that everybody's questions are going to get answered today, but feel free to do that. And with that, Mike's going to come around with a microphone, and we'll go from there. Yeah. And we're doing the mic because also so the folks online can hear you. So yeah.
Jacy answered the question of whites coming into the valley. And you said, if we love this earth as much as you, then we're welcome. How do you feel?
Yeah, I think this land has much abundance, and it's a magnificent place to be at home. It's a magnificent home. I think about every time I drive in, when I get to off the Minham grade, about old Joseph's deadline, where he tried to prevent the overtaking of this land by outsiders. And it didn't work. And he died about 10 years later. And his sons succeeded him, although everyone calls young Joseph Chief Joseph. Both Ollicott and Joseph were co-chiefs and old Joseph was the successor of his father-in-law. He became the chief of his wife's band. He wanted to protect our way of life. He wanted to protect this beautiful place because, and people don't realize this, Lewis and Clark came in 1805, the trappers and traders came, missionaries came. We had already met people who were indigenous and mixed blood from the East Coast. The stories about what had happened to other native peoples and their lands already had infiltrated this country. We had foreboding, we had forewarning about what the potential loss was. I don't think any of us can imagine that rumor mill and what it must have felt like to hear. If we're the only people who live here and it's a remote and it's not an easy place to live, that someone is going to come and take our land. But once gold was discovered north of here, and this became not part of the Nez Perce Reservation, and the Looking Glass, White Bird, Tuhulhulsot, Joseph, and a Palouse band lost their lands in the Thief Treaty of 1863, we were angry. We were in enormous pain. And yet, what we tried to do as people from here, they tried to coexist peacefully with people in the valley. And that coexistence only worked if both parties worked at it. And I think we're still at that place. We have to work at that coexistence, because I remind my friends, I have dear beloved friends here in this valley, but I remind them there are fewer than 7,700 people in this county, 7,639 or some last count. There was never an issue of there being enough land for all of us. That has never been a discussion. Is there enough land here for all of us? It was the right to exclude us that was exercised against us. And so I think people have to acknowledge that, yes, that's a painful chapter in our past. But the reason my uncle co-founded with Joe Hallam and Terry Crenshaw the Wallowa Homeland Project was he wanted to have a place where we could feel welcome, where we could experience not hate, but kindness, where we could build bridges with the people who live here so that the relationships we have with people who are here now are as important as the relationships we have with our relatives from the other reservations after the diaspora, after the war. And I think people also need to realize that we're still healing ourselves. We're still trying to take care of this home, this land, everything that lives here. And we're not doing it in a hurry. We're not in a panic. We've never succeeded. We're always deliberate in our ways because there's risk associated with failing to be deliberate. And so we do not want people to think that we are unkind or unwelcoming ever, because the land is welcoming. But we do, as Jacy talked about, not only our knowledge, protect that and try to pay it forward and teach it forward, but we also try to protect that which is precious. So when blind Mose would only speak his language, it reminds me of young Joseph. He could speak English. He didn't make presentations in English. He used his language and a translator, Red Thunder, most of the time, later in life, because he wanted to be able to fully express himself. And the last talk he gave that was arranged by Professor Meany at the University of Washington in Seattle, the crowd was disappointed. They wanted their money back because it wasn't the full oratorical narrative that he had provided in so many places that was so fabulous. He was a disappointing performance. For this is not performance for us. We're bearing our hearts. And that requires reciprocity. That is not about conversation and talk. That is about doing. And I think that that's the hard part of what we live with, is that the survivors, families, we're the handmaidens of the ancestors who are still watching us, and they expect us to do things. Mm-hmm. And so if I get impatient, it's not usually with non-Indians, because I don't have the right usually to boss them around. But boy, with my own family, we get really demanding.
Mm-hmm. Well, the expectations are higher.
Much higher.
My mom says that too. If I worked under her, my mom is the medical administrative director for Yellow Hawk. She's worked her way up from a nurse also. And now she is running the medical department. And if I ever wanted to work for her, I'd have to work twice as hard as everybody else because it's expected of me, because we have a high standard of each other. Yep. People think that you would get it easier to work with your mom. Oh, that's not the way it is here. You're not given that was great. We're given the less that my grandma said, the better I knew that I did. The less critiquing that I had, the better that I knew I did. But they were also hardening us for the outside, because not everybody is as welcoming as the people here in this room. Not even today.
Right.
So those things that we were given harshly from our grandparents, my grandpa talked to me really harsh sometimes. I got roasted really bad in my house, but nobody else was going to hurt my feelings on the outside. Nobody could hurt my feelings because I was I was raised that way. I was raised to be like, this is your family, this is who you trust. But on the outside, you need to remember the people that you're protecting in this circle, and you don't want it to be taken advantage of, used wrong, or to hurt somebody else. Because some of our practices are really strong, our dedication and our I don't never really call it a religion. It's just the way that I live my life. It's not very, it's structured, and there's a certain way, there's order, there's 7 songs, the start, the bell tells us when it's the next time or the next process or the next thing that we need to do. We're all disciplined, but we know when we can let it go. We know when we can cry. We know when we can laugh. We know when somebody needs to laugh. So it's a different way when I have to explain it to different people. And I've seen the change in Wallowa, from the first time watching my grandma walk through the grocery store in Wallowa, and people are looking at my grandma ugly. My grandma is the most beautiful person, the kindest person I've ever met, has the softest skin. Her hair is always fixed. She always matches. Her shoes are always nice. No matter what, she always looked nice. She'd never look disarrayed, nothing. If you're going to get dressed, you get dressed all the way, or you don't get dressed at all and you don't go. So if I was to wear my Indian stuff, I got all the way ready. I braided my hair the right way, or I didn't go. I wasn't allowed to wear it. But all the hard work I did for her, I got paid back. There's so many knowledge and so many memories that I have that I get to pay into my daughter, and that molded me, and stories that Bobbie told me that molded me into a human that I wanted to be, because I want to leave this place better than before. And it's different that people weren't raised the way that I was, to see that not necessarily people, that things, that trees, that a favorite basket that I dig with is part of my family. It's just not these people. And I didn't know that people weren't raised that way. I didn't know that people weren't raised to see the way that I seen, because we were so engulfed in it. I'm so engulfed in it. So I don't see it as religion. It's just the way that I live my life.
I think the answer to your question is twofold. One of which is people don't realize this, but in our cultures, there is no stigma for being poor. The worst thing you can be in our culture is stingy.
Mm-hmm.
And the second worst thing is to be lazy. And we manage by shame. So those of you who've ever worked with us should know that if you're being teased to death, there's a reason. Management by shame, it's in every coyote story. It's in every story we tell. When there's a little bit of shame in there, that's an ethic. And those things that because we're not supposed to be stingy, but because we've been hurt, we've been harmed, because we've had much injustice pushed on our plate, we are protective. And so I don't think anyone should read our sort of protective habits, our carefulness or our deliberateness as being stingy. We're just trying to be correct. And that, as Jacy's described, is on us. Our expectations, I'll be quite candid with you, our expectations of non-Indians is less.
It's understandable. Yeah.
Because
it's like walking out on ice that has broke before. You're not just going to walk right back out there.
Yeah, we have to be careful. And the less isn't because of so much disappointment as much as we know you don't think the way we think, and we know you haven't been trained the way we're trained. And so whenever we're around somebody bad who's misbehaving, yesh or polai or whatever, our old people would not, criticize and say ugly things about them. They'd say, "Oh, remember who raised her."
It's a reflection of your family. It is. Because when people ask you where you come from, I don't say I belong to my mom or my dad. I belong to Les and Lonnie Alexander. I belong to them. I'm a product of them. And so even now, I put my best foot forward because my kaza is watching me. My grandpa is watching me. And I am still proving to them everything that I make is still for her. Everything that whenever I am on a drive and I'm like, I know I can make it. I grew up in the mountains and I make it home safely, no slips. Grandpa, like, look at my skills. I'm still proving it to them. I'm not proving it to anybody here on earth. I'm proving it to them because they gave it to me and I want to prove it to them.
Yeah.
And so it's different.
But I think that it's not only that we're protective. We are trying to ensure the future. And so it's the deliberateness is not so much about withholding something from someone else as it is preventing further loss. And I always used to be amazed because, I went to Pendleton High School and I saw police brutality. I witnessed firsthand lots of things that were demonstrations of what other people would just say is racism. And that was never in our house, that with my mother and my grandparents. I can't say this about all the other households that came out of that house, but in those households, we did not swear, we did not cuss, we did not raise our voices. If that happened, boy, there was something really big going on.
We couldn't even say that we hated anything.
Right, we weren't allowed to either. And what my grandfather always said was it was ignorance. Any faux pas, anything that went sideways, anything that didn't proceed properly, he would blame it on ignorance. And because ignorance is curable. And they would not, my mother, my grandfather, they would not allow us to say that we failed at something because the odds were against us or because they didn't want my brother to play because he was Indian. He wasn't on the starting line. He was on the starting lineup anyway, but it's like they would not allow us to say it was because of discrimination. The expectation, as Jacy has said, was so much higher that even if they're discriminating, you better do so well that they cannot afford to discriminate against you. Be the most valuable player on the team so that you're quarterbacking, they can't afford to not have you play. Be that good. And so that
be better than you yesterday.
That's standard is high. And so in our families, it was like, my brother and I've gotten in slamming door fights, and we don't do that. We were not allowed to do that, Roy. But we got in a fight about one of his kids saying that there was discrimination. It's like, you were never allowed to think that way, say that thing. You were never allowed to accept the outcome. We were raised to overcome it. And so I think sometimes because of those standards that we've talked about, we are fierce.
That I would agree with. Yeah.
We're unapologetic about being fierce because we have a lot to take care of.
I'd like to just see if there's anybody else.
Sorry.
No, you're great. Like I say, it's there. I know I'm also thinking about you guys because I know you got to hit the road. Is there anybody else that has a question? Yes, Eric over here.
I asked this question from being a member of the queer community who currently the ancestors that have created the pathway for me to be who I am today, their histories, their stories, and their impact are being erased in culture, in our government, in our world. What advice and insights, reflections, comments do you have for other communities whose stories are constantly trying to be erased from the narrative that we get to hear?
Don't accept it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we've had much erasure pointed at us.
So what they think
is,
anybody think anybody can be a stereotype. There are stereotypes of queer community. There's stereotypes of me. There's stereotypes of white people. We probably joke about it a little bit more than we should. But if you're put in the right circle, you go in the circle where you feel welcome. You go in the circle where you can make an impact. You go in the circle where you feel that your presence is valuable. If you're in a circle where you don't feel that way, you're in the wrong circle.
That's right. I've gotten off of boards of directors because I didn't feel my input was valued. And, you vote with your feet.
And I don't want to be discriminated because I'm Native. I don't want to be discriminated because I'm a woman. I don't want to be discriminated because of my education, because my education was done at home in a sewing room, because I know a lot more about a sewing machine than a lot more other people do. So, it can't be judged. It's where you go to find that you're needed. You go, just like we were told, our family was always taught that if you're going to go to school, if you're going to leave this community, you go get back and you bring it back. You go get what your community needs and you bring it back. But you have to find your community first. If your community isn't what you were born into, then you have to find your circle, and then you go out and you get stuff to make your community better. That's what we were taught. If we were to leave home, you go home and you get something good to bring back.
So we have this massive history of structural assault. So going back to the doctrine of discovery and the Spanish, and to Spain and Portugal and the Pope into 1490s, up to the Declaration of Independence. Both the doctrine of discovery and the Declaration of Independence declared war on Indians in this country, or natives in this, indigenous peoples in this country. The Monroe Doctrine was another declaration of war against our people. So we have structural assaults pretty regularly through every presidential administration that come our way. And we're still here. So we have not been accepting of it, but the form of our persistence and our resilience and our resistance isn't always visible to other people. Our narratives, our stories being told, our published authors, our creative geniuses, our fabulous expressive songs and dances, all of that is a form of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And we're never, not only are we, the one key thing that I always want to remind people, we've never left and we're never leaving. So get over it. And secondly, we never gave up. They say that was Joseph's surrender speech. That was the end of a siege, a 5-day siege. And he was the only headman left in camp to talk.
Mm-hmm.
We have never surrendered, and we never will.
I think there's one of my friends works for the Park Service, and she's always moving around. So last time I checked, I think she was at Bandelier. She just got a missive that there was Two-Spirit literature in the park system, and they told her to get rid of it. Like they had to erase all that. So I think now is really, we're facing something that, is targeting and separating and dividing individuals. And so it is a frightening time. So right now, it's a scary time, I think, for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, within my own tribe, and, I have heard Native people, I was on a train with when I was in Perce, and I was traveling with some Blackfeet, and they were saying they're talking about another Native writer who was gay and openly gay, and they were saying bad things about him. I was like, I don't want to sit with you people. I'm going over here, And so I think it's like there's always an individual, and that's what I love about. That's what I love about many tribes. It's about, my culture is different than Nez Perce. We see things differently, whole different cultures, whole different ways of seeing. So we're not pan-Indian or have the same ideas. But I think one of the things that's really interesting, when the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act came up, many of the tribes, including the chief of the Yakima, my own family were saying, we don't want this, because what it does is gut the power of the individual. And they talked about a chief was responsible, man or woman was responsible for getting a consensus with people, even the children, going and saying, well, what do you think? And how do I move forward? How do we move forward as a people? So, you know, a lot of people, Jim Welch used to tell this story about Magpie he was like he was going to be the chief, and he was like, no way, I don't want to be the chief. And he ran up in the mountains and was hiding, and people had to drum him down. They had to sing to him and bring him down because it was such a responsibility. Because caring for each individual and the rights of each individual and the ways in which we all walk this earth as individuals and contribute. We're not a tribe, you know, and like so we're not just kind of like, yeah, not an amoeba. And so people are, you know, we all have these different ways of thinking, and you know, I encounter prejudice in my own tribe, and I try to wipe that out. And I'll try to say, you know, I don't agree with you. But I think now I do have those kinds of fears when that's our culture. How dare somebody come in and say that we can't talk about two-spirit, that we can't claim that, or that has to be erased. What other culture has a right to do that to another culture, to just begin to say, that's not the story we want to hear. That's not what, you know, how we see ourselves. And, you know, that rise of the Christian right is, you know, one of the most frightening things, you know, that we're facing now. So that individuality of all of us is really important, as well as our traditional and beliefs. So I stand with you. I stand with my brothers and sisters, and I stand with my non-binary friends, and we're all together.
Well, and the creator created us. He didn't make any of us the same for a reason. My kata always told me that. My grandma's always like, how cool is it? When she would say cool, it was so funny because it sounds so weird. She's like, you know, that's cool, huh? And I'm like, oh my God, don't say that. But she'd be like, how cool is that the creator, he found all these little pieces, just like a puzzle, and he put you together. He didn't want you to be like nobody else. He specifically put you together just the way that you are. So don't be ashamed of that. He took a lot of thought, and he took all these pieces to create you just the way you are. So why would you want to change such a masterpiece that the creator made? And in our culture, I don't think like gender specific is as big of a thing. I mean, we do have certain roles, you know, that we have to get done. But my uncles, if I wanted to go hunt and I wanted to go fish, I just had to get done what my grandma had told me to get done, and then I could go be a boy.
Which is a good shot.
I am a good shot. So I'm a hunter, and I want to get my first salmon gaffing this summer. And, you know, I want to be this person, and I wasn't held back. I wasn't said, hey, that's a boy thing. Hey, you can't do that. Hey, go put that dress back on. You know, like my grandma had to literally buy me matching shorts for all of my dresses because I didn't know how to keep my legs together or keep them down or sit with my legs, you know. That's probably why I got a job in Wallowa County. But, you know, my grandma was always, you know, he made you the way that you're supposed to be. And so my grandma saw my talents before I saw them. And so she worked on them. My uncle saw that I wanted to be outside, and that was something I was interested. So he took me out to the mountains. And so the family that you have, the community that you have, will find your best things, and you can work on those.
Best teepee poles ever made were by her grandpa. Smoothest, no snags, no bumps.
Well, and you do it right. You do it right. You always do the right thing.
Perfection.
You do it the right way, so then you don't have to go back and do it again.
That's right.
You know, and you make the next right choice. The next right choice. And if that's too hard to think of, if the creator and you were standing there and you said, I have this choice and this choice, and you're like, I'm going to pick this one, but then don't pick it. You know, pick the one, and then you get better and better choices. And now I got a good choice and a good choice instead of a shitty choice and a kind of okay choice. You know, the more right decisions you make for you and this life that you're trying to create on earth, then you get better and better decisions. I've been starting to make more and more better decisions, and then good things come to me. And I'm like, what? You know, it's abundance. When you put good out, then you get good back. And you don't get to feel that unless you're actually doing it.
Thank you for that. And thank you. So is there a question online? Anything else? Before we're getting pretty close here. So No questions online. One more. Okay, one more question in the back and then we will. We're gonna wait so our folks online can hear you. So thank you for being patient here. Yeah.
I'm curious as to what the effect of the appointment of Deb Holland has been on the Native American communities. And what you think is going to be irreversible about what she did, given the change in the government.
Could you repeat that, Mike? Could you maybe give that talk into the mic? We couldn't quite hear you up here.
I'm curious as to what you think the effect of Deb Holland has been on Native communities, and are her effects likely to be reversed by our new Secretary of Interior from Montana?
You can't unsee the office she held. You cannot unsee the office she held. It has happened. It's a fact. You cannot unsee that a member of our tribe was the director of the National Park Service. That's not undoable. The bar, let me finish. The bar has been raised, not for the federal government. When I look at that, the bar has been raised for what we can do. So you may look at what policy has been written on paper that can be undone. Well, Congress does that to us all the time. So we look at those kinds of achievements. The astronaut, was he Chickasaw? We look at those accomplishments because we have Coyote stories about Coyote going to the moon, and there was nobody there, so he came back. But we look at those accomplishments, and I think that when you look at with the lens of what did she do for government, what did she do for the United States, what did she do for Indians, I see it from inside my culture, and I say, wow. There are so many more Deb Hollands in Indian country who can do the kinds of things she did, and it can be done. We can achieve that again and again and again. And so role models, that's first. Lasting impact, you can't undo the boarding school study. You can't undo, now they could undo the Carlisle Industrial School National Monument. They could say it's not, but it has already been declared a national monument. They can take that away. But it's still going to be Carlisle Indian Industrial School, all of us. We have people who went there. So the facts that these people have been in these positions and that she was able to sign legislation or sign into regulations and policies, things that can be undone, doesn't mean her work was for naught. Not any more than Jacy's grandmother's teachings or my grandmother's teachings. Just because you don't see me live them every day doesn't mean they're not there. And I think we live with the impermanence of federal policy and federal regulations. It took until the 1990s for us to get the Native American Graves Repatriation Protection Act. People have been displaying our relatives in museums as skeletons for a very long time. That took a very long time to get that legislation. It almost got undone. It finally got renewed. The Violence Against Women Act, the trafficking of Indian women all over the United States and Canada, all of those things, they're still real, they're still facts. Deb Holland shone a light on them at an elevation that they have not seen before. You can't unsee it. And so I think what people want is sort of something like the 10 Commandments carved in stone. We're not going to get that. We're not going to get that. But what we do get is the lasting change that we have achieved this in our lifetimes, and more people can follow in those footsteps. For me, that's huge.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And with that, I think that's a good place to stop. I do, I have many thoughts, but I'm going to follow my own advice and go get coffee and talk to you later. So, I do want to close this whole event if we can, and I'd like you to just take a breath. A lot of feelings and emotions in the best possible way. Thank you, Jacy, for giving us permission to act on our own vulnerability, because you kind of put it out there. So thank you very much. Everybody still have this? How many of you actually did any of this? Did anybody circle that map? I'm just curious. Yeah, did you? Okay.
Good
So
job, good job.
I'm not gonna ask you, I was gonna give opportunities for sharing, but we're running tight on time. But I do have one question that I want to ask. Well, raise your hands. Has anybody in here learned something in the last 3 days they did not know before? Have you come up in your head with much like this call to action? What are you gonna do with that? I want you to stop and think for a second. What are you going to do with what you learned? Who are you going to tell? Who are you going to share these stories with? What are you going to do with it from here? I had somebody come up to me yesterday at dinner and made a suggestion that I'm going to issue as an open invitation. How do you carry on these conversations? How do we keep talking about these ideas? This space is what is a place for that. So if you want to have conversations or get a group of folks together, for those of you that are in the county and you want to call us and say, can we meet on Wednesdays at 5 o'clock and have conversations? The answer is going to be yes. Unless, of course, Mike says that we can't because we have a workshop here. But, the answer is yes. You have a place here for those conversations. Keep talking to each other. We're going to keep making these conversations possible. We've had conversations with Wallowa Resources about how do we continue those conversations outside in more regular ways? Do we set up a fireside that's a conversation opportunity? So I want you to think about that. What are the stories you've heard this weekend that have made an impact on you? Stories are part of all of our lives. They're going to continue to be. I'm going to recommend you do something. It's something I do. Go home today and write them down. Don't hope that your memory keeps them because they won't. Go home and write them down, even if it's just one story that you heard. Who are you going to talk to of the folks that you met on the panelists this weekend? A lot of us are super fortunate. Look at the wealth of people we get to live with here. These people are all part of the Fishtrap community. Who do you want to continue a relationship with? Think about what that could be for you too. And then finally, what I want to ask you, and I will say, if there's somebody who feels brave that wants to answer this question, I'll open it up. How has your perception of the West changed this weekend? Or has it? Does anybody want to actually say if there's been a change for you? It's okay if the answer is no. Yes.
Just that, it wasn't maybe, I heard Bobbie say.
Hang on a second here, David. Yeah.
I heard, there was a quote that has stuck with me from Bobbie, for a number of years. And I heard her mention it again today, and it's I'll probably mangle this, but it's, from the, native perspective, from the Indian perspective, the settling of the West was the unsettling of the West. And as a white kid who grew up here with settler ancestors who were part of the invasion of the Nez Perce homeland, we learned in school about the triumphalism of settler greatness. And so that quote has been like an antidote to that piece of propaganda that has, been inculcated in us over years, me, in the school system that we go. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. That's a real, I think, a very concise, important thing to hold in your head.
For those of you that don't know David in the room too, I think you've made your life work really, truly telling a more wider version of that story of the county. And I want to thank you for that. Yeah. David runs the Wallowa History Museum and is doing pretty amazing things. So thank you for that. Anybody else want to share if their perception of the West has changed? Okay, Rich, don't point at anybody. No poking.
No, you don't need a microphone, Rich, but
Yeah. So Giuseppe always said that the West is the most urban part of the United States. More people live in, a higher percentage of our population lives in urban areas than in the East.
Mhm.
He said what distinguishes the West is that we live outdoors. Even people in cities have to have a barbecue on their panel. patio,
true.
right? So that's one of my thoughts about the West. And I think the other thing that he said is we tried to erase Indians, but we left them this little spots of land. And what they've taught us is the connection to land. It's what sustained them. It's what's kept them here. And I think that the West has always had that relationship. And we're turning it backwards. The East is now learning from Western tribes that they have land and a stake in land.
Thank you.
You know, I want to say, like, as we close this thing about the West, I always thought that's such a, you know, when we talk about colonialism and like the West, you know, and I was thinking all of my elders prayed all four directions. And so saying the West is like, what about it? So it's
West of
all,
us?
you know, it's all part of that. Even in the West, there's all four directions. So it has that kind of lopsided effect. And then somehow we've been relegated to live in the West of mythology, and that isn't that probably is none of ours. It's been an invention of Lewis and Clark, and you know, discovering manifest destiny, you know. And I think if we're going to manifest a new destiny, it's the destiny that we hold. I love that Bobbie was talking about agency. Do you know we had Indian agents? We have, like, the BIA is an agency. What I loved about the Secretary of Interior and Deb Haaland, she became the agency, you know. And like when you talk about, like, it kind of freed us. I felt like finally felt free from that heavy sort of being told, go to the Indian agent. And, you know, the Indian agent would, you know, on letters my grandmother wrote, the Indian agent, she said, Louise is my granddaughter and she will live with me. I have control over my granddaughter. She is my blood. And the agent wrote on the Mr. Branson, the superintendent at my reservation, said, arrest Louise and take her to the county jail and tell Mrs. Vanderberg that she has no control over. I control this. I'm the Indian agent. And I thought, phew, not with my great grandma. She used to hide my, you know, when the agent would come, she'd hide up in the woods. Like, she'd take, you know, my mom said, gee, in the middle of the night, the agent would come and they would run. If it was 10 below zero, they'd jump out through the windows and they'd go up and wait until that Indian agent was gone. And even now, if somebody knocks on the door, my husband knows this, I will hide. I won't answer the door because I was just trained to do that. So I do not. So that's what Deb Haaland means to me. Like, something bigger than any act that she can do. She becomes like that symbol of a freedom that we have. And, you know, like I like the idea of writing down because I'm a writer. I write things down. But I also like the thing of just the experience that settles in our blood and bones, and we take that with us. And it's something that we change the way that we see the world. We change our vision, which is bigger than, you know, anything that we can write down. And so, you know, maybe you leave here with that kind of vision. But and I am going to defer to the Nez Perce. Like, I'm not going to have the last word up here, so I'll be quiet now. But I do want to thank you again. Thank you for allowing me to be in your company. Thank you for the gift of your stories. And I learned so much, and I found a sister, and I feel good. I feel good. I feel happy, and feel so happy I might cry.
So with that, I think we have closed out Winter Fishtrap. Mike, I think next couple of weeks you'll get a survey out. I would ask that you please fill it out. It helps us make sure we're doing what we need to do and that you're getting what you need from this. Also, please feel free to reach out to either one of us with your thoughts, with your cares, your concerns, or, you know, you just want to tell us we're pretty, we take that too. So I thank you so much for being here, for being part of this conversation. Please keep showing up. The work we're doing together is, I think, never more important. And with that, Ketchiaya, and we'll see you next soon. I forgot, I promised. We have raffle drawing today. Okay, it'll be great. Yes, you ready? Want to see if you won. Jacy, thank you.
Ketchiaya.